Hey guys, this is Dave here with a look at Lego City Undercover on current generation consoles. The game originally arrived on the Wii U a few years ago, but now it's finally available for PS4, Xbox One and Nintendo Switch. And well, this is the version we're particularly interested to see. Lego City Undercover isn't a fully blown current generation game, but it does feature plenty of enhancements over the Wii U original, which we'll cover in a bit. But for now, let's just say that lighting, shader effects, texture quality have all been upgraded and brought to a current generation style standard. So with that said, how well does the Nintendo Switch compare to the current generation platforms? To kick things off, here's the PlayStation 4 and Switch versions side by side. And well, what can I say? First impressions are very good indeed. Both versions are running at native 1080p using the same post-process anti-aliasing solution, so we get a nice crisp image on a full HD screen with both versions. That said, image quality isn't identical between the two machines, and if you look at PlayStation 4, the visuals appear smoother and slightly more refined. There's less pixel popping and shimmering on screen, which provides a generally more natural presentation. The result of this comes down to the depth of field implementation. There's a higher quality bokeh effect on PS4, whereas this is downgraded to a more simpler version on the Switch. The result is the depth of field actually blurs over quite a lot of the distant scenery, and as a side effect of that, reduces the amount of jaggies and shimmering on screen. On the other hand, jaggies and pixel popping is more prominent on the Switch version, so image quality isn't quite as good here, but on the flip side, the game actually appears sharper because there are fewer elements out of focus, so we get a crisper looking image on Switch, but with slightly reduced image quality. The extra sharpness on Switch isn't the only benefit on Nintendo's console. Curiously, draw distances on some elements are actually better on Switch. Yeah, kind of unexpected really, but take a look at the fences here. Notice that the wire grid is clearly visible here on Switch, but hasn't actually been rendered yet on PS4, and doesn't actually appear until you move much closer. Of course, when looking at other areas, there are no unusual wins for Switch, and in fact Traveller's Tales has reduced certain visual elements in order to better match the core assets to PS4 on Nintendo's weaker hardware. So for example, shadows are rendered at a lower resolution on Switch, which means there is more in the way of sawtooth edges on screen. These artifacts aren't completely avoided on PS4 either, but the results are generally smoother and a bit more pleasant to the eye. Reflections are also reduced in resolution too. Interestingly, on PS4 these are actually filtered quite well, so they have a very smooth diffused appearance despite the underlying low resolution nature of the effect, whereas on Switch there are clear stair steps on show here. Ambient occlusion is another area where Switch suffers. The effect appears to be missing on the platform, whereas on PlayStation 4 it looks like HBAO is present here. And this helps to bring about more depth with the surrounding environments, giving the game a slightly more three-dimensional look. Outside of that though, there are very few differences to be seen, with the same upgrades in lighting and mostly asset quality between the two consoles. However, texture and normal map quality is reduced on Switch here. Lower resolution assets are in play, meaning things such as the road and brickwork lack the extra level of fine detail present on PlayStation 4. This is probably the most noticeable difference between the two versions overall, and is one area where the extra memory on PlayStation 4 definitely has a tangible benefit. That being said, I do think that the Switch version holds up rather well during gameplay. Outside of picking out like-for-like scenes, you're getting an experience that comes pretty close to PS4. You don't quite get the same level of refinement with regards to effects quality, and some of the assets are slightly reduced in resolution, textures for example. But generally when playing you get the representation that the Switch version is very close to PS4, and the majority of the upgrades over the Wii U game is present on this version too. So here we've got the Wii U versus the Switch release, and there's a considerable difference between the two. In terms of resolution, well, that part is obvious. The Wii U version is running at 720p resolution, whereas we've got 1080p on Switch, so there's no upscaling artifacts there, and the world, the characters, generally image quality looks a lot sharper and clearer. But digging deeper, and there are plenty of upgrades on show. Perhaps the most dramatic is with regards to the whole lighting and shading pipeline. It's completely different. Physically based rendering is clearly present in the new Switch version, so everything from the gravel on the road to the shininess of the Lego bricks all appears pretty realistic and react differently under different lighting conditions. The presentation here is a lot closer to other current generation Lego games such as the Lego Movie and The Hobbit, rather than the Wii U original. There are also improvements with regards to the core artwork as well, so we get reworked textures and normal maps across quite a few surfaces, and generally the quality of these assets is higher across the board. Basically higher resolution textures, so we get more intricate details on show, and this means that things such as the mountains and the road surface just appear clearer than they did on Wii U. Draw distances on fences are also improved, as you'd expect, and the environment outside Lego City is also further fleshed out on Switch in a few scenes. Notice the extra mountains around the coastline here, that's not present on the Wii U game. Shadow resolution is also up too, so there's slightly less in the way of sawtooth edges, but this area of the game perhaps could use improvement on both, and shadows do often look quite rough. These are perhaps the biggest upgrades on Nintendo Switch, but in some areas it does appear that Traveller Tales has pared back certain elements. For example, reflections actually appear to be lower resolution on Switch. And in other scenes there are also the removal of certain ceiling lights and the faked light shafts that go along with them, which are removed on both Switch and PlayStation 4. This seems more like an artistic change rather than a downgrade though. But overall, whether you're playing on the Switch or PlayStation 4, both of these versions offer up a considerable graphical improvement over the Wii U original. From what we've seen so far, the Switch version holds up very well in docked mode, but what's it like to play on the handheld itself? Well, in terms of the resolution, we're looking at a native 720p presentation, so everything is one-to-one pixel mapped with the console's display. And for the most part, graphical quality is relatively unchanged. Texture detail and the majority of the effects work appear exactly the same as they do in docked mode. There are only a few little tweaks. Anisotropic filtering is dialed back slightly, so ground details appear slightly blurrier when playing on the handheld, although on the small screen it's not something that obviously pops out. Fence draw distance is also reduced too, so the wire portion of the fence draws in a little later than it does when in docked mode. But aside from that, the core graphical visuals are basically the same between the docked and portable modes. Performance is the only area where I feel that portable mode does indeed fall short, and from what I've played it kind of looks and feels somewhere between the docked mode and the Wii U game. Unfortunately we can't capture direct feed footage from the portable mode just yet, but by eye it's still clearly noticeable that frame rates don't hold up quite as well all round. Moving on to performance, and this is where things start to get really interesting. Since the switch to the 360 and PS3 era, the LEGO games moved from targeting 60 frames per second to 30 FPS instead, with the idea of pushing much higher quality visuals, essentially pushing for more accurate shading and lighting, thus providing a more realistic take on the cute Lego visuals. But with Lego City Undercover, there's something different going on. Taking a look at the PlayStation 4 version, and the game actually alternates between 30 FPS and 60 FPS depending on the rendering load. So in less demanding scenes such as walking through this police station here, or during some of the sort of more side-scrolling style segments of gameplay, the frame rate basically comes in at 60 FPS. And what can I say, it's a really good experience. The controls feel crisp and the motion is smooth. However, once we get outside or we venture into more complex areas, the game instead operates at 30 frames per second. And indeed the frame rate appears to be capped at that level. There's no yo-yoing between 60 and 30 mid-gameplay. One scene plays out at 60 FPS, another plays out at 30 frames per second. And perhaps what's interesting here is the game also uses an adaptive VSync too, so when the engine can't quite hit 30 FPS, we get a single torn frame appear. The game mostly holds 30 FPS very well though, although it's not perfect and there is an occasional dropped frame here and there, which produces some very light stuttering from time to time. It's not really a major issue, but it's kind of curious to see that frames are being dropped when in other areas performance is, well, there's plenty of headroom and we're getting double the frame rate. While I appreciate these sections that run at 60 frames per second, I think for consistency it would have been better to have a 30 FPS cap in place, since that's the frame rate that the majority of the game operates at. In terms of the Switch and Wii U versions, the situation is a bit more traditional. Both games are capped at 30 frames per second, so there's no weird 60 FPS shenanigans here. But between the two, the Switch actually delivers improved performance over Wii U. Neither version can hit a rock solid 30 FPS at all times, but in demanding scenes the Switch version takes point. Metrics drop down further on the Wii U, resulting in more stutter and more disruption to gameplay, whereas on Switch the engine kind of recovers more quickly. The experience isn't quite perfect though, and there are still some large bouts of stutter on the Switch from time to time. However, across a general run of play, the experience does feel a bit more stable than on Wii U, even though it's not perfect. In that sense, while it's disappointing that the Switch doesn't deliver a locked 30 FPS or closer to a locked 30 FPS, it's also worth bearing in mind that visual quality isn't that far behind the PlayStation 4 version, so performance here, on balance, isn't too bad. And well, it looks and feels more refined than playing on the Wii U, so that's generally a good thing. Okay, so we've discussed PS4 and the Nintendo versions, but what about the Xbox One game? Well, we have an interesting situation here. In terms of resolution, the game actually features a reduced horizontal pixel count, so the title operates somewhere between 13 to 1400 by 1080, and this provides a slightly softer presentation. It's not massively noticeable during gameplay, but both PS4 and Switch offer up a slightly more refined image here. Outside of that though, and the Xbox One version comes very close to matching PlayStation 4. In fact, it's pretty much identical other than a slight difference in ambient occlusion. Both versions hand in an otherwise identical presentation with regards to the core visual quality. Performance is also very similar too. Basically we have a kind of 30 and 60 FPS setup. The game runs at 30 FPS in more demanding scenes, while it targets 60 FPS in less demanding moments. And generally performance is very similar to PlayStation 4 throughout. Although saying that, the game appears to be slightly more stable when running at 30 FPS. We don't get the odd torn or dropped frame that appears on PlayStation 4. However, during sections where the game is running up to 60 frames per second, there's some tearing and a few small frame rate drops. So the experience in these 60 FPS sections isn't quite as smooth as on PS4, whereas the 30 FPS sections, Xbox One has a slight advantage. So to wrap up, if you're after the most refined overall home console experience, then PS4 is the way to go, with Xbox One coming in at a close second. Meanwhile, the Switch provides a decent home experience, but with the option to play on the go, and although portable mode isn't quite as smooth as docked mode, I still found the game quite enjoyable to play. and it's a nice bonus being able to take the game on the go as well. Anyway, with that said, I think that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed the analysis, don't forget to like or subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Huh?